Many years ago, there was a game designer named Shigeru Miyamoto, known for creating Mario, Pikmin, and of course, The Legend of Zelda. Released as a launch title for the Famicom Disk System in 1986 in Japan, until being localized for the NES in 1987 internationally. The game was a grand adventure, with battles, exploration, and dungeon crawling. Yes, it is one of the most beloved NES games, and has spawned a legendary video game franchise. Many years later, there was an adventurer named Nintendom who wondered how Miyamoto had created such a masterpiece. He decided to explore the catacombs of the internet, and he began to discover the secrets of Zelda's creation. The story of The Legend of Zelda begins with the Family Computer, or Famicom, which was eventually turned to the Nintendo Entertainment System internationally. This revolutionary gaming system was exploding in popularity, loved by kids all throughout Japan, but it wasn't perfect. It was very limited on a technical level, and Nintendo knew it. They knew that the Famicom's ROM could only do so much, so Nintendo decided to develop an all-new add-on for the system, the Famicom Disk System. It was going to feature disks, akin to floppy disks, with enhanced memory, the ability to save your progress, and the ability to allow players to overwrite their disks with new games. It had the capacity for better sound, and best of all, it had my boy Discoon! But it needed a launch title that would show off these new technical features. This is when Shigeru Miyamoto comes into the picture. He noticed the popularity of adventure films at the time, such as Indiana Jones. He had an idea for a new kind of adventure game. Precursors like the game Adventure by Atari existed, but this was going to be a total innovation of the genre. Role-playing games and adventure games were very popular in Japan, but they were usually text-driven. Miyamoto wanted a game that focused on the player having the tactility of moving their character through the game's world. He was going to be involved in almost every part of developing the game. The original concept for The Legend of Zelda was actually a game where you not only played through dungeons, but also were able to create them. Please make Zelda Maker, Nintendo. I know I'm too dumb to make any good dungeons, but I would be happy just knowing it exists. This idea came from the Famicom Disk System's technology, as it was able to rewrite game data. But the developers realized that playing through the dungeons was the most fun part, and thus they decided to make a game in which the player travels through dungeons that exist underneath Death Mountain. According to this Iwata Asks interview, the initial specifications for Zelda were dated February 1st, 1985, titled Adventure Mario, likely because they hadn't thought of the name Zelda yet. Plus, every document for the game was labeled Adventure. The specifications mention the structure of the game, with one page showing off what appears to be a dungeon layout. I unfortunately have no picture of the second page and would probably sell my left index finger for it, but the second page apparently showed items and weapons such as the compass and boomerang. Interestingly, it showed, quote, gold and silver, which presumably became rupees, which, by the way, according to Miyamoto, were not named after the Indian currency of the same name. The third page shows art of enemies, as well as showing a 2x2 square to indicate how large specific characters should be, including notes labeling enemies by if they're small, medium, or large. There were enemies called, quote, octopus and, quote, eyeball, which, based on their names, probably became Octorok and Goma. Ganon's name was labeled as Hakai, which the translator of this interview interpreted as being a reference to Cho Hakai, the Japanese name of a character from the Chinese novel Journey to the West, which makes sense as the character is often depicted as having a pig's head, just like Ganon. This story must be really popular over there, as I've mentioned it twice in the span of making 3 main Nintendom Hour videos. There were also these rough sketches, dated February 13th, 1985, and shows enemies and items, as well as seemingly showing what their in-game sizes were meant to be as well. Toshihiko Nakako, a programmer for the game, recalls the team and himself talking over the sketches as they made them. There appear to be crossed out drawings, which while not touched on in the interview, this could indicate that these were scrapped, or perhaps the artist simply felt they were drawn incorrectly. We can already see designs of enemies and bosses that would appear in the final game, as well as ones that don't appear to be. Quick pause for a sec. Hyrule Historia translates the date for the same sketch as being in December 1983 rather than February of 1985, but that seems to be a mistake based off the Iwata Asks interview as well as the Zelda Encyclopedia, which consistently have early sketches dated in February of 1985. As stated before, this game was originally going to be solely dungeon focused, and thus there was a menu to select the dungeons, with them showing the dungeons from a somewhat three-dimensional view. They even recreated this 3D view in Family Basic, an official Nintendo product in Japan that can be used to create Famicom games. They had the initial specifications down, but they had no title. They were going to create the legend. But of what? The Legend of... I imagine this is along the lines of what Shigeru Miyamoto and the team were thinking. They knew it was the legend of something, but not what or whom. The PR planner suggested to Miyamoto that he try and create a storybook for the game, in which the hero saves a beautiful princess with eternal appeal, and thus Shigeru Miyamoto decided that the book idea sucked, but the PR planner had said something else to him. He gave him the suggestion that the eternally beautiful princess could be named after a famous American author's wife, Zelda. It is widely believed that the PR planner was referring to Zelda Fitzgerald, the wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald, writer of famous books like The Great Gatsby. Miyamoto asked if he could use the name Zelda, and the PR planner okayed it, and thus Miyamoto knew what the title of this legendary tale was: The Legend of Zelda. At least according to a Google translation of this German interview, Tezuka added Zelda because he wanted a romantic element. I know digital translators can be iffy sometimes, but it makes sense given that I can see the German word romantic in the original interview. Plus, I'm sure it'll delight Zelda Link shippers everywhere. As for the story's hero, the team decided upon Link. According to Miyamoto, he was named Link because he was meant to, quote, spread the scattered energy of the world throughout the ages, as stated in Hyrule Historia. He later talked more about the initial reason for the name, stating the crazy fact that I still can't believe. His name was Link because he was meant to connect the past and the future, because the pieces of the mythical Triforce, originally called the Power Triangle in early screenshots, fun fact, were initially electronic chips, like the ones you'd find in a computer. Personally, I think they look more like tortilla chips. I gotta stop recording these videos while I'm hungry. Chips. Link's sprite was first drawn by Takashi Tezuka, a co-director of the game along with Miyamoto. It was difficult to create a memorable character from a sprite that could only be made up of 3 different colors. His weapons were made to be very large and prominent on screen. The only problem was, how is this tiny character sprite going to be noticeable next to his large weapons? The solution was to add fairy-like features like a pair of long ears and a big hat, as they would make him stand out more. They gave him an elvish design due to the similarities to fairies. Random side note, I wonder if that inspired the fairy spell from Zelda 2. They chose the color green because Miyamoto was a big fan of Disney and was thus inspired by Peter Pan, which also helped the issue of the limited colors and also fit the forest areas in the game. Peter Pan also inspired the aforementioned long ears. While initial drawings by the team depicted Link as right-handed, Link was made left-handed for the purpose of making the pixel art and for, quote, configuration in game screens, which I imagine is just Hyrule Historia's fancy way of saying it was to make Link look good in-game. The story was written by Tezuka, who was a big fan of fantasy novels by J.R.R. Tolkien. The team wanted the player to explore and find out more about the history of the region, named Hyrule after multiple brainstorming attempts. Ganon was created to be the villain who keeps going after the Triforce, and Impa was made to be a storyteller who gives information to Zelda, but also sets Link on his quest. Her name comes from the word impart, presumably because she imparts information to both Link and Zelda. The game had a title and a story, but a game needs a world, and that's what we're going to talk about next. As a child, Shigeru Miyamoto loved to explore his hometown of Kyoto, Japan. He would climb trees in the forest. He'd explore hillsides and caves. He once recounted a meaningful experience, the time when he climbed a giant mountain and made it to the top, where he found a large lake. As Miyamoto worked on Zelda, he and the team realized that they wanted to explore the overworld as well, and thus he took inspiration from his childhood for that overworld. He wanted to create the feeling of exploring forests, hills, and caves, comparing the gameplay to the feeling of biking around in a new city. The game was built around the idea of freedom. Miyamoto wanted a game that forced players to be creative in how they play the game and to think about what they should do next. The environment was inspired by Hakoniwa. Hakoniwa refers to miniature gardens, which are popular decorations in Japan for homes. They take a landscape and capture it in a small space. It almost reminds me of a haiku, taking an idea but capturing it with only a few syllables. The Hakoniwa inspiration makes sense when you think about the top-down view of Zelda. It's like you're looking down at a tiny world. I can easily imagine 8-bit Link running around in this little garden. Miyamoto took his experiences of exploring the Kyoto landscape and struck them down into what is essentially a playable Hakoniwa, capturing not only nature, but his childhood memories. The drawings of the overworld map started as blueprints of different areas, hand-drawn by the team. Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka then created a map of the entire landscape, Tezuka drawing the left side, and Miyamoto drawing the right side, drawing dots to represent rocks and trees, and using correction fluid to erase any mistakes made. For the first landscape drawing, it's super detailed, and it even already featured the Lost Woods. Miyamoto wanted the world to be large because he felt that if it was too small, it wouldn't be fun to explore. Later on, the drawing of the entire main overworld was created by the developers, and I was gonna say I would give up my right index finger to have this map, but I just realized, I'm a me. I already don't even have fingers. But it's just so cool. It looks like a map Link would have drawn himself, or perhaps would be given to him by a mysterious old man. All those little notes and drawings you see were made by using tracing paper, which is transparent, and was overlaid over the map, so that the developers could easily make changes without changing the main map drawing. They changed character and dungeon locations as they added new game mechanics and made improvements to the game. The team wanted dungeons to be easy to explore with a simple map. Due to technical limitations, many dungeons needed to be mapped together in a 16:9 grid just like the overworld. Because of this, the various dungeons were pieced together like a 16:9 puzzle, which reminds me of Potomino's come to think of it. However, Tezuka accidentally only used half the data he was supposed to. This ended up being a blessing in disguise, as it gave Miyamoto the idea to add the second quest, a harder variant of the main game that changes dungeon designs and for me, mostly consists of this. These are documents that show the dungeon enemies divided into groups, Type A and B groups, or Type A, B, and C groups. The Type A, B, and C groups document shows easier enemies as Type A, harder ones as Type B, and of course bosses as Type C. Based on the notes to not mix Type B and C, I'd assume this document was used to keep track of which enemies were placed in what dungeons and in which rooms in order to balance the difficulty. The world and dungeons were created beautifully, being iconic to this very day. I still have many overworld screens burned into my brain. But there was another piece of the Potomino puzzle that would make this game unforgettable. Everything about Zelda is iconic, but what is the first thing you think of when you think of the game? For me, it's the music. Zelda's music is incredibly memorable, so much that throughout the series, music and sound have even been used as core mechanics. That started even with the first game, where Link can use the recorder to warp to different dungeons. Koji Kondo, a beloved video game composer who also composed the music for Super Mario Bros., knew he needed to bring something different to the table for The Legend of Zelda. In The Legend of Zelda documentation, there was sound direction for Kondo. He was given the incredibly helpful description for the cave music, short BGM, or short background music. Now, Kondo was probably like, what the hell am I supposed to do with that? And the musical direction for the fairy fountain was, quote, fanfare sparkly, which is interesting actually, considering fairy fountains and caves, neither one of them have their own musical themes in the final game. Perhaps they were cut for space? Luckily, despite Kondo's limited instructions, he had an advantage here that he didn't have for Super Mario Bros., the advanced capabilities of the Famicom Disk System add-on. Remember how I said how the Famicom Disk System has better sound? What I meant by that is that it has an additional sound channel. Koji Kondo states that it has vibrato, which Oxford Languages defines as, quote, a rapid slight variation in pitch. This extra channel allowed him to write waveforms, graphical representations of sound waves, and store them in memory. To do this, he had to use another program to analyze sounds of whatever instruments he wanted to use, like a violin for example, and then select the results carefully in order to get a realistic instrumental sample. However, most of the game's music doesn't actually use these samples. It's saved mostly for sound effects such as the sword beam and the sound of monsters. He also used it for the Recorder's tune, which had to go through dozens of different versions, as Miyamoto wanted it to sound not only pretty, but also mysterious. The most iconic use of the Famicom Disk System's new sound channel is definitely the title screen music. You'll never guess what sound direction Kondo got for this one. You ready? It was, and I quote, title music. Very specific and helpful. The plan up until near the game's launch in Japan was to simply have an arrangement of the classical piece Bolero by Maurice Ravel. They figured that the song was public domain due to its old age. It was public domain. 1 month after the game was set to release. This was a big problem. They couldn't just delay the game, as it was set to be a launch title for the Famicom Disk System. So, Koji Kondo, in the span of one night, managed to arrange the Overworld theme into the incredible arrangement that is the title theme. With The Legend of Zelda saved from a delay, it was time for the game to release, along with the Famicom Disk System. The Legend of Zelda was tested for about a year, being developed simultaneously as Super Mario Bros. Nintendo was focused on ensuring their games were quality rather than focusing on short-term profits like many other Famicom developers were doing. In that time, the developers were able to add more than they thought they possibly could. Unfortunately, the credits of the game used pseudonyms for the team members, such as S. Miyahan, referring to Shigeru Miyamoto. This used to be a common practice in Japan to avoid other gaming companies poaching their employees. The team added the subtitle A Hyrule Fantasy in Japan due to the game being an adventure with a lot of classic fantasy elements like swords and magic. The team included a manual to provide instructions, but also due to the fact that discs could be overwritten with new games using a disc writer. A manual would allow people to prove that they had bought The Legend of Zelda and have something tangible come with it. The Legend of Zelda was released in Japan on February 21st, 1986 as a launch title for the Famicom Disk System, and was then released in the United States on August 22nd, 1987. The international version had to be changed from the Japanese version in some ways due to being on an NES cartridge instead of a disc. The main difference was that the sound was changed due to not having that extra sound channel that the disk system had, most notably the title theme. The international version also came with a map, but Miyamoto suggested putting the seal on it so that players would only use it if they absolutely needed it, but acknowledges that most people just broke the seal anyway. The game was a great success, selling 6,510,000 copies internationally as of 2003. The Legend of Zelda was eventually released as a standard Famicom cartridge on February 19, 1994. It has since been released numerous times. It was released in the Game Boy Advance NES Classics line, was included in the Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition for the GameCube, released on Virtual Console for the Wii, 3DS, and Wii U, added to Nintendo Switch Online's NES app, and was included in the Legend of Zelda Game & Watch for the franchise's 35th anniversary in 2021. It even got its own TV show, also titled The Legend of Zelda, which is where the infamous, "Well, excuse me, princess," line comes from. The Legend of Zelda is one of the most influential and important games ever made. It truly created a world that it's still fun to explore all these years later. It's nearing 40 years old, and yet it's a game still worth remembering. It created an action-adventure franchise that means so much to so many people and inspired many other games. And that ends the tale of how Nintendom found the secrets of The Legend of Zelda's development.